Hello, fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics, and to the critique of the first 5 chapters of David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. Today we'll be covering the first half of Chapter 3, Unfreezing the Ice Age, where the authors try to argue that human beings did not begin as egalitarian hunter-gatherers by ignoring the first several 100,000 years of human existence. So, the thesis question of this book, which the authors finally ask towards the end of this chapter, is how did human societies get stuck in dominance hierarchy, which today is how almost every society on Earth is organized, where some people have more power, more wealth, and more rights than others. We already defined hierarchy a couple of episodes ago, and we talked about what that means in a political context. Politics means decision-making in groups, so a political hierarchy is one where people are ranked into different categories/classes according to different levels of decision-making power. Kings over lords over serfs, owners over managers over workers, officers over enlisted soldiers, parents over children. And the whole point of this book is to tell us that while it may seem like we're stuck in hierarchy today, and while it may seem like the circumstances of industrial civilization necessitate hierarchy, it doesn't have to be that way. Human beings used to choose our own social structures in the past, in all kinds of different conditions. And in fact, the very thing that makes us human beings is our ability to choose our own social structures. Therefore, we can change our social structures again if we can only remember that we have the power to do this. Now, maybe the main source of the confusion of this book is that the authors don't distinguish between a democratic hierarchy and a dominance hierarchy. And also, they seem to have no concept of how dominance hierarchy actually works. A democratic hierarchy is where a group of people voluntarily organize into a hierarchy in order to achieve some kind of goal. And while the people on the top of a democratic hierarchy have more decision-making power than the people at the bottom are still the ultimate deciders, in that the leadership position only exists because it serves their interests. And they can remove the person filling that position if they're not happy with their leadership services. And they can even remove the position entirely if they want to. And all of the terms of getting to be on top of a democratic hierarchy, like the degree of authority and responsibilities that you might have, and the rewards that you might get, if any, are all ultimately determined by the people on the bottom of the hierarchy. A dominance hierarchy, on the other hand, is something that people on the top impose on the people below them, and they're able to do this because of differential bargaining power between the two sides, the people on the top and the people on the bottom. If the people on the bottom tolerate that power imbalance, it's because they don't have any better options. Like the way that you go to your job and obey your dingus boss every day, because not going to that job will be worse in various ways than going there and putting up with all this crap. For an example of a democratic hierarchy, even the most hyper-egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, who have no chiefs or authority figures, when there's a hunting party, the hunters will often pick someone among them who has a lot of experience and good skills and instincts to be the party leader. Not only do these hunting leaders not have any official authority, but the second that people don't like what he's doing, they'll either stop listening or they'll never appoint him again, depending on the circumstances. Now, sometimes the lines might get blurry between a democratic and dominance hierarchy. Like there's a bit of a spectrum, which we can talk about more another time. But a good analogy to know which kind of hierarchy you're dealing with is like the difference between sadomasochism and sexual assault. On the surface, they might look like the same thing, but the second someone says stop, and the other person doesn't stop, then it becomes sexual assault. So, by definition, when the authors ask us, how did we get stuck in hierarchy? What they're talking about is dominance hierarchy and not democratic hierarchy. Now, one thing to note about dominance hierarchy is that since by its very nature no one chooses to have it imposed on them, dominance hierarchy can only exist if there are certain conditions or circumstances that give some people a set of advantages which allow them to impose their dominance onto other people. These sorts of conditions are things like, I have guns and you don't. I'm an adult and you're a child and you depend on me for food and shelter. Or, our economy depends on fishing and my family got to this fishing spot first and we're numerous and strong enough to control it by force and you have nowhere else to go to get your fish, etc. And so, by not distinguishing between democratic versus dominance hierarchies, and by not understanding that dominance hierarchy can only exist because of conditions and circumstances, the authors of Dawn of Everything create a lot of confusion when it comes to understanding why we got stuck in hierarchy, and more importantly, how we can get unstuck. For example, starting in this chapter and in the next chapter, the authors give us all of these examples of traditional societies that have democratic hierarchies, like the Nambikwara, who have a chief who has no coercive authority, and who loses his position if people choose not to follow him. And then they point to societies which had seasonal dominance hierarchies, like the Inuit, who had patriarchy, but only in the summer. And then they say, see, social structure is all a matter of choice. People used to move in and out of hierarchy all the time for expedience, and they used to disobey their chief if they didn't like them. There's no reason why people would need to be stuck in hierarchy today. But when they say that, they're totally missing the point that a hierarchy of expedience is a democratic hierarchy, while today we're stuck in dominance hierarchy and not democratic hierarchy. And they're completely oblivious to the fact that the people on the bottom rungs of those seasonal hierarchies, like Inuit women in the winter, well, they were in fact stuck in those hierarchies. It's just that the conditions that got them stuck, i.e. the conditions which gave men a bargaining power advantage over them, only lasted for a few months every year, as we'll see later on in this chapter. Now, before I get into the text of the chapter, I want to lay out the basic building blocks or ingredients of dominance hierarchy. And once I do, it'll be a lot easier to understand what's happening in this book, and more importantly, to understand what's going on in the world around us. The particular details of the road to dominance hierarchy will be different in every case, but the general path is always the same. The only way that you can get to a dominance hierarchy is if two general conditions are met. Number one is that some people are able to control access to the resources that other people need in order to live. And number two is that you also need for there to be no easy or preferable way for those people who don't control the resources to go off and find other alternative resources somewhere else. Those are the ingredients of dominance hierarchy. That's it. That's all. In any given situation, if you want to understand why there's a dominance hierarchy and why it's milder or harsher in one place than in another, then your task is just a matter of figuring out what the circumstances are which establish these two criteria. And if you want to reduce or get rid of that hierarchy, you need to figure out how you can change or moderate those circumstances. So for an example of how these two criteria work, in our society, your boss tells you what to do all day and not the other way around because he controls the salary that you need in order to eat. That's criteria number one. But if you could just go start a farm in your backyard and survive easily that way, and if you could easily just save up and buy a 3D printer to make all the things that you need, well, then you wouldn't need to waste time doing what your boss wants for much longer than it takes to save up to buy the printer and to set up your farm. When capitalism was getting started, people did have farms in their backyards, and they also had access to common lands that their animals could graze on, and forests that they could hunt in and fish in. So most people had no reason to subject themselves to being bossed around and abused by some asshole all day for peanuts just to enrich him and his ugly spoiled brat monster children. So you didn't have criteria number one or number two. And capitalists in those days had trouble getting their enterprises off the ground. But what the capitalists did have is a lot of wealth inequality versus the peasants. And they also had control over the state. And so, the capitalists, via their influence over the government, did everything that they could to take away these alternatives to employment servitude. They closed off and privatized formerly common lands. They made it illegal to hunt in certain forests and to fish in certain lakes. And they pulled all sorts of other legal shenanigans to make it harder and harder to survive by farming. As a result, formerly free farmers were now forced to choose the labor market in order to survive. So those are the criteria that give you hierarchy. But you also want to pay attention to the specific conditions in order to understand the degree of dominance that people in power get to exert, i.e. how stuck you are. Why do some people get paid really well at their jobs and have decent working conditions, while other people get paid barely enough not to die, and they have humiliating, miserable working conditions? In capitalism, that will usually be a factor of market conditions. You might not have a Star Trek 3D printer replicator, but maybe you do have a really rare work skill, like an expertise in corporate tax law that's worth a lot of money to wealthy employers. Or maybe there's a labor shortage and you have 20 employers that want you to work for them and who have to compete for your services by offering you better wages and working conditions. So conditions number one and number two are still met. You still have to obey someone in order to eat, but they're not as dire. You have some degree of escape, at least from one employer to another. But if you have 20 applicants competing for every job that you're qualified for, or if you have no savings and you can't afford to be unemployed for more than 3 days without getting evicted, or if you have diabetes and depend on your boss for health insurance, well, then condition number two is way more restrictive for you, and you will be much more stuck than a tax lawyer or a trust fund diaper person. Okay, now that we have a clear idea of what dominance hierarchy is about and how it works, let's read the book. The authors begin the chapter by telling us that, quote, accounts of human origins play a similar role for us today as myth did for ancient Greeks or Polynesians, or the dream time for indigenous Australians. there actually was an age in which the lines between human and animal were still indistinct, and when someone had to light a fire, cook a meal, or perform a marriage ceremony for the first time. We know these things happened, but we don't really know how. It is very difficult to resist the temptation to make up stories about what might have happened, which reflect our own fears, desires, obsessions, and concerns. As a result, such distant times can become a vast canvas for the working out of our collective fantasies." Unquote. And this is exactly right. Ever since we realized that humans evolved from other species, the domain of human origins has been a hotly contested battlefield, both in academia and in popular literature, with people projecting their political ideologies into the giant gaps in our knowledge, gaps which have been shrinking over time, leaving less and less room for speculation. And since that time, you've always had two basic camps, the right and the left. And remember that the right means those people who support particular hierarchies, while the left means those who want to reduce or eliminate those hierarchies. So, unsurprisingly, thinkers on the left generally argued that we had egalitarian origins, and that therefore we are best suited to live in societies of relative equality. And those were the kind of arguments that Rousseau and later Marx and Engels made, and that many hunter-gatherer experts today make. And then you had thinkers on the right who either believed that we had hierarchical or at least ultra-competitive origins, and that we were best suited to live in natural hierarchies, like Hobbes argued, and like, for example, Jordan Peterson argues today. Another right-wing argument that gains importance among people with anthropological knowledge is that even if we did have egalitarian origins, that this was a bad thing, a state of childishness, and that we couldn't reach our full potential without hierarchy, which is what the 18th century economist Turgot argued, which Graeber and Wengrow highlight for us in Chapter 2. A more modern argument justifying hierarchy, which Graeber and Wengrow point out in Chapters 1 and 2, is the liberal cop-out synthesis idea that, well, maybe we are best suited for equality, but it's just not achievable anymore because civilization is just too damn complicated and large. And the authors attribute this to Rousseau, and they quote Jared Diamond articulating this idea very explicitly in Chapter 1 of the book. And even though Jared Diamond is kind of a liberal leftish type of guy, and Rousseau is often seen as the founder of the political left, this is a right-wing argument, because justifying hierarchy is by definition right-wing. So at various points in history, one or another version of these left and right ideas was more popular or more prominent, and different variations on these themes appeared and evolved as new information and evidence came in, which constrained the limits of our imaginations and narrowed the spectrum of possible scenarios about our origins. And today, in Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrow are trying to position themselves above this fray by taking a weird, postmodernish third position where we have no particular origins. We sort of just magically appear on the earth with all sorts of social structures, somehow, which I don't really think is even possible. And if you know how that might work, let me know. And Arnold Schroeder pointed out recently in Fight Like an Animal podcast that this idea itself is quite mythological, especially since it doesn't make any sense. But I guess the point that the authors are trying to make, which does make some more sense at least, is that when it comes to hierarchy or equality, our nature is to have no nature. And they go on to tell us that the essence of being human is our ability to choose our own social structures. And like Arnold says, Graeber and Wengrow's origin myth is that once upon a time, we all had all of this agency and choice, and we could and did assemble and dissemble ourselves into different levels of hierarchy and equality, because of expedience or theater or play, as the authors tell us later in this chapter. But then, humanity mysteriously fell into a state of becoming stuck in hierarchy, maybe because we all became dumbasses, as the authors suggest later on. And so, the solution is that we need to remember our freedom in order to regain our freedom, as the authors circularly tell us in Chapter 1. Anyhow, after a couple of centuries of going back and forth between right and left visions of human origins, which waxed and waned in popularity with events like the rise and fall of the French Revolution, the rise of global colonialism, the rise of capitalism, the rise of socialism, the rise and degeneration of the Soviet Union, and the rise and fall of fascism and the Cold War, eventually, in the 1960s, a version of the left-wing egalitarian origins theory basically won the debate. And this has been the consensus, or at least the majority opinion among the relevant experts since that time, much to the chagrin of Graeber and Wengrow, or Graeber, as Matt Christman is calling them in his review of the book. And if anyone has any contact with him, please let him know about this series. Anyhow, this victory of egalitarian origins started with the Man the Hunter conference that I discussed in earlier episodes, which brought to the fore the existence of hyper-egalitarian societies, all of whom practice the same type of immediate return nomadic hunting and gathering that our earliest ancestors are thought to also have practiced. Since that time, it's been assumed that Rousseau and Marx and Engels were basically right. Our ancestors were indeed egalitarian, either hyper-egalitarian, like most immediate return foragers, or at least they were relatively egalitarian, like most other kinds of hunter-gatherers that we know about. So now, I'm going to explain what the current synthesis version of egalitarian origins is, and why most people with enough expertise to have an informed opinion still believe in it. And this is really important for readers of Dawn of Everything, because Graeber and Wengrow attack the idea of egalitarian origins without ever explaining to us the logic behind it. And as a result, it makes it seem like the people who believe in egalitarian origins are just stupid or in denial or something. Our current understanding of what our original social structures were like, in terms of the presence or absence of dominance hierarchy, is largely a synthesis of the work of Christopher Boehm and Sarah Hrdy, plus some psychology and game theory research done over the last few decades on people from societies around the world. Christopher Boehm tells us that the Hobbes versus Rousseau debate about whether humans are innately cooperative or competitive is a red herring. The Rousseauian idea of humans as inherently good-natured, cooperative, egalitarian smurfs, and the Hobbesian Gargamel view of human nature as selfish, competitive, and hierarchical are not in conflict. They're both correct. We all have a tendency to want advantages over others, and therefore to be at the top of a dominance hierarchy. But we also innately hate being dominated and exploited by others, and we will do what we can to prevent it if we can, which usually means teaming up with others to stop would-be dominators. It's the conditions that we find ourselves in that either give some people an advantage that they can use in their quest to dominate others, or else that give the advantage to the people who are trying to resist domination. And as it happens, the conditions that our earliest ancestors lived in were such that we were able to successfully form coalitions to resist domination, at least for the first 95% or so of our existence. And the result was egalitarian societies, where everyone has equal or relatively equal decision-making power. One of the practical conditions of our earliest ancestors, which allowed people resisting hierarchy to win the day against would-be dominators, was the invention of lethal projectile weapons by our Homo erectus ancestors. Once Johnny Homo erectus invented lethal projectile weapons, it was no longer possible for alpha males to maintain the types of dominance hierarchies that we see in our chimpanzee and gorilla cousins today. Because even the wimpiest Pee Wee Herman Homo erectus could just kill off the biggest macho man high-T alpha male with a spear from a safe distance. And of course, our female hominin ancestors, and not just male Pee Wee Hermans, could use these weapons as well. Females could also have been a main driver in weeding out alpha males by simply refusing to have sex with them, which would have been much easier to do with the existence of projectile weapons. Or with the help of male relatives, which implies matrilocal residence, which has its own egalitarian implications. Graeber and Wengrow don't mention it, but Boehm calls this process of killing off the alpha males and of banding together to prevent domination the, quote, egalitarian revolution. And this revolution is how Boehm believes that we became human beings. The physical features that we see in animals, where males compete with each other for dominance, like males being a lot bigger than females, or like males having giant fangs or canines, or thick brow ridges to prevent our skulls from getting crushed from blows to the face by our competitors. These traits fade out over the millennia, and almost disappear by the time our modern ancestors appear on the scene 300,000 years ago or so. Basically, alpha male dominant types just kept getting themselves killed off over and over, and people had to learn to cooperate on an egalitarian basis if they didn't want to get murked by some pissed off Pee Wee Hermans and women's. And the climactic conditions of the Paleolithic, plus the conditions inherent to the types of hunting and gathering that people did in that era, were such that there was just no way for a bully, or more likely a coalition of bullies, to succeed in their attempts at dominance, at least for very long. And these conditions favoring egalitarian social organization continued until after the advent of agriculture and the environmental conditions of the Holocene geological era, which eventually, in combination with other factors, made it harder and harder to prevent domination and easier for bullies to form coalitions with which to dominate their former peers. Boehm doesn't go too deep into theorizing about the conditions that favored egalitarianism, but he mentions various things which hunter-gatherer specialists discuss often, like the mobility of hunter-gatherer groups in that period, which means that people could easily escape any attempt at domination, criteria number 2, and the instability of the Paleolithic climate, which made it very hard for anyone to dominate any particular territory or hold on to any particular dominance formation for very long, criteria number 1. Meanwhile, Sarah Hrdy's work tells us that more than just not liking to be dominated, humans also do innately love cooperating and working together, and we are hardwired to do so in many ways. Given how expensive it is in terms of calories and energy and time required to raise a human child until it could feed itself at age 45, 46, human beings could not have survived without cooperative child rearing. And unlike other great apes, where mothers would never dare leave their children in anybody else's care, humans not only let their immediate family take care of their kids, but we also trust and cooperate with unrelated humans to help each other with childcare. Today we have public or for-profit daycares, depending on where you are, where unrelated strangers take care of our kids, but hunter-gatherer camps are a lot like giant daycares where everyone is the staff helping with the little McNuggets. And the only way that we could cooperate on this level, before a wage economy, was by evolving all sorts of traits that could not likely have emerged in a very hierarchical or competitive society. Traits like involuntary facial expressions that give away our feelings, or like the cooperative eye, where the whites of your eyes are visible so everyone can see what you're looking at, which other great apes don't have because they're constantly competing with each other, and everyone knowing what you're feeling or looking at would be a reproductive disadvantage in that case. And Hrdy doesn't mention this in her book, but scholars from the radical anthropology group that I always talk about, like Camilla Power and Morna Finnegan, have pointed out that many of these sorts of situations, like caring for unrelated infants, could not likely have happened if people were organized patrilocally, and that therefore this suggests matrilocal residence. And in turn, this means that at least our earliest ancestors were most likely gender egalitarian as well, contrary to what Boehm says in his work, which focuses on dudes killing each other. There are also a lot of other reasons to believe that we are egalitarian. For example, like I mentioned last time, the most hyper-egalitarian societies that we know of from modern times all practice the same kind of economy that most of our earliest ancestors are likely to have practiced. And the practical conditions of that type of economy usually favor political egalitarianism. There's also evidence from the way that technology was spread out and trading networks and artifacts were distributed, and even mitochondrial DNA evidence that suggests matrilocal organization, which is often, but not always, associated with political and gender egalitarianism. Anyhow, all of this stuff, plus some psychology experiments about cooperation and domination, all of this more or less constitutes the dominant egalitarian origins thesis that Graeber and Wengrow are trying to belittle in Dawn of Everything. So back to the book. Graeber and Wengrow set the scene by telling us that humans today, for all our superficial differences, are all basically the same animal with minor variations, not only in terms of our bodies, but also our behavior. And they name some human universals like eye rolling as a sign of disdain, as well as the structural commonalities of all languages, and the universality of music and dance as features of all societies. However, according to the authors, quote, rewind a few hundred millennia, and all this was most definitely not the case, unquote. And they tell us that up until about 40,000 BC or so, Homo sapiens were sharing the Earth and interacting with our now extinct human cousins, like the Neanderthals and the Denisovians and the smaller-brained, more ape-like Homo naledi. And, quote, the result probably would have struck a modern observer as something more akin to a world inhabited by hobbits, giants, and elves than anything we have direct experience of today or in the more recent past, unquote. I like this description of the deep past, and I wonder if that's the source of those types of legends about elves and dwarves and giants. But then, the authors tell us that even though Homo sapiens came up on the scene about 300,000 years ago or more, we can't really have any idea of what our ancestors were doing in terms of social organization until 260,000 years later in the Upper Paleolithic. Quote, there's only so much you can reconstruct from cranial remains and the occasional piece of knapped flint, which is basically all we have. Most of the time, we don't really know what was going on below the neck, let alone with pigmentation, diet, or anything else. It seems reasonable to assume that behaviors like mating and child-rearing practices, the presence or absence of dominance hierarchies, or forms of language and proto-language must have varied at least as much as physical types, and probably far more, unquote. So in these three sentences, we have two extremely questionable statements. Saying that we can't possibly know anything about what social organization was like before 40,000 years ago is like saying, well, we can't possibly know who murdered Colonel Mustard in the dining room because all we have is some fingerprints on a candlestick and some blood and some mysterious hairs. Or, we can't possibly know if there are other planets beyond our solar system because we can't possibly see them with even the best telescopes. Like, it's true that we don't have VHS videos of the Paleolithic, and this kind of rationale might make sense if you know nothing about forensics or spectral analysis or archaeology, but as we know from TV murder mysteries and from Clue, the game, we can actually make decent assumptions with what seems like scant evidence. And the idea that it would be reasonable to assume that the presence or absence of dominance hierarchies must have varied at least as much as physical types. Like, how does that even follow? We never get any explanation or theory about how hierarchy works or forms. We're just expected to intuitively accept this bizarre craniometry logic. And as we'll see, this argument about hobbits is actually the author's only real argument for the presence of dominance hierarchies in the Paleolithic. But first, let's tackle the idea that we don't really know anything about social structure until about 40,000 years ago. If we just take one of the main sources that Graeber and Wengrow cite in this section, an article by Eleanor Scarry called The North African Middle Stone Age and Its Place in Recent Human Evolution, which is cited in footnote 4 of this chapter, we can already see that this statement is not true. And the Middle Stone Age, aka Middle Paleolithic, goes from about 280,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. So let's read some snippets from this article. Quote, hunter-gatherers in the North African Middle Stone Age were extremely seasonally mobile. They had low overall population sizes and followed increasingly complex and diversified subsistence and social practices. Subsistence strategies included the use of both large game and small fauna such as birds, tortoises, and mollusks. At Sai Island, people processed siliceous and starchy plant materials. This constitutes some of the earliest documented evidence for plant processing behaviors. Together with raw material transport distances of up to 200 kilometers and shell bead transport distances of 190 kilometers, these data show that the North African Middle Stone Age populations were highly mobile. Significantly, these distances are comparable to those covered by ethnographically documented hunter-gatherers in arid regions. It is likely that overall population size varied significantly with the arid humid cycles of the Sahara, indirectly triggering social responses such as long-distance social networks. The concurrent emergence of technological regionalization, extensive use of pigments, bone tools, and personal ornamentation in North and Southern Africa, as well as the later cultural efflorescence in East Africa, have been linked to possible isolation and increases in overall population size, triggered by environmental stability and amelioration. Environmental risks such as strong seasonality and prolonged drought may have also provided the impetus for material culture diversification, as has been demonstrated." Unquote. So this isn't riveting stuff, but in just this one article about one region of Africa, we have all of this information about what people were eating, about how mobile we were, about how we had symbolic culture, and we had similar dispersal and congregation practices as modern hunter-gatherers do in similar environments. The article doesn't say much about social structure in regards to dominance hierarchy, but with all of that information, there are a lot of inferences that anthropologists can and do make based on the social structure of contemporary foragers, practicing the same types of subsistence activities, and their migration patterns, etc. And there are all sorts of other articles and book chapters that you can find talking about pigment use and rituals, burials, how meat was cut and distributed. And you even have articles figuring out that the main type of descent group in the Paleolithic was likely matrilineal, based on the way technology and religious artifacts are spread around, and also from mitochondrial DNA evidence. Notice that in the article that I just read from, the author keeps linking human behavior and social organization to environmental conditions. Semi-arid environments lead to small populations stretching over larger territories. High resource abundance often leads to less migration. Large social networks are a response to varying humidity, and the migration patterns look like those of modern foragers who react to all of those same conditions. And you'll notice as you read Dawn of Everything that this sort of reasoning is almost totally absent when it comes to explaining dominance hierarchy, except in a couple of little places in the book, like the one that follows the part that we just read. Quote, "The only thing that we can reasonably infer about social organization among our earliest ancestors is that it's likely to have been extraordinarily diverse. Early humans inhabited a wide range of natural environments, from coastlands and tropical forests to mountains and savanna. They were far, far more physically diverse than humans are today, and presumably their social differences were even greater than their physical ones. In other words, there is no original form of human society." Unquote. Okay, so they're repeating their craniometry argument, but at least they're adding a material component to it. People had different wiener sizes, and we also inhabited a wide range of environments. That's better, and it makes more sense. Except that that's not at all how material conditions work when it comes to dominance hierarchy. A particular natural environment doesn't just automatically equal a particular social structure. Again, though, note that they're telling us that we can't possibly know anything about social organization from the archaeological record, but then they're also telling us in the same sentence with full confidence that we can somehow assume that there was a lot of social diversity, and that there was no original form of human society. So what's wrong with assuming that humans must have had diverse social structures in terms of dominance hierarchies because we lived in diverse environments and had physical diversity? This seems intuitively reasonable if you're Homer Simpson, but if you're an anthropologist who studies this stuff, and you've read some books, then you know that the type of environment that you live in and the size of your skull or your wiener aren't the relevant material conditions that determine social structure, at least not when it comes to hierarchy or equality. For example, the Mbuti pygmies are on average about 4 foot 6 inches tall and live in the Central African lush rainforest. And they have almost the exact same hyper-egalitarian social structure and very similar values and cultural institutions as the big and tall Montagnais-Naskapi foragers who lived in the coniferous forests of Quebec and Labrador in the 17th century. And they also have very similar social structure and similar values and institutions as the Kalahari bush people living in the Namibian desert. And also the same as other foragers living in the mountains of India and the rainforests of Malaysia. So why are all these cultures who are physically so different and living in such different environments so far from each other, so similar in terms of social structure and other cultural traits? Doesn't this show that environment is irrelevant to social structure? No, because when it comes to hierarchy or equality, we're looking for whether or not the existing conditions enable some people to control the resources that other people need in order to survive, and whether or not there are any easy alternatives to those controlled resources. Living in a desert versus in a savanna or rainforest or Arctic tundra aren't what determines these things. In the case of the societies that I just mentioned, it's what you do for a living in those environments that ends up generating the conditions relevant to favoring egalitarianism. And those conditions end up being very similar despite the wildly different environments. All of these groups do what is called immediate return nomadic foraging. And as we'll see when we look at Chapter 4, the practical realities of nomadic immediate return foraging usually generate conditions that result in societies with very high levels of freedom and equality. Now, the environment is in fact very important, in the sense that the environment will determine what sorts of economic activities are possible in a given area, and what sorts of economic activities are optimal, meaning you get the yummiest foods with the least effort. Immediate return big game focused foraging is thought to be one of the most efficient and desirable types of foraging, but you need for there to be a pretty low population density. And then you need enough availability of wild animals and foods that provide a balanced diet, or else you can't practice that type of economy. So, for example, it's possible that the Ituri rainforest, where the Mbuti people live, could not sustain immediate return foraging until the intrusion of Bantu farmers into the area, because the rainforest alone doesn't provide enough edible carbohydrates for people to survive. So the Mbuti can only live as foragers in that forest because they obtain carbohydrates via special trade relationships with the Bantu. Anyhow, the authors then go on to talk about how the sapient paradox isn't really a paradox, which is correct and we don't really need to get into it. But then, interestingly, as part of that discussion, they use some more materialist arguments in order to hypothesize about why there was a lot of cultural activity in Europe as soon as Homo sapiens first migrated there about 40,000 years ago. Quote, "It may have something to do with climate and demography. To put it bluntly, with the movement of the ice sheets, human populations in Europe were living in harsher and more confined spaces than our species had encountered before. We have to picture our ancestors moving between relatively enclosed environments, dispersing and gathering, tracking the seasonal movements of mammoth, bison, and deer herds. While the absolute number of people may have still been startlingly small, the density of human interaction seems to have radically increased, especially at certain times of year, and with this came remarkable bursts of cultural expression." Unquote. And unlike the nonsense about how presence or absence of dominance hierarchy must have varied a lot because people had different size hoo-has, this is actually a solid assumption. And it's something that we've seen happening throughout history and prehistory. The more people interact, the more art and technology flourish as people learn and build on top of the ideas of a larger number of people. That's why art went from amazing three-dimensional portraits and sculptures in ancient Rome to weird two-dimensional clunkerdunks in the Middle Ages, and then exploded to Rembrandt level in the Enlightenment era, because the roads and trade routes connecting Europe to itself and to the outside world collapsed after the fall of the Roman Empire and only re-emerged by the end of the Middle Ages and towards the Enlightenment era. So when it comes to cultural flourishing, the authors have no problem with materialist arguments. But we'll see as we go that when it comes to explanations for dominance hierarchy, those same kind of explanations and ideas fly out the window, or rather they get buried under the rug. So this next section is called, quote, "Why even very sophisticated researchers still find ways to cling to the idea that social inequality has a, quote, origin." Now, this is an extremely weird title choice for this section, because while I would have loved to see the authors explain why people believe in egalitarian origins theories, they very glaringly do not do anything of the sort. Instead, they just critique Christopher Boehm, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, for believing in egalitarian origins, and then they act like they're puzzled by his beliefs, while straight up disappearing the part of his book where he actually explains his reasoning. So here the authors tell us that because we can't possibly know what was happening for the first 200,000 to 400,000 years of our existence, which as we've seen isn't really true at all, that they're just going to skip right ahead and start their inquiry into the original forms of human social structure at 40,000 years ago, which is what Chris Knight jokingly calls the tea time of everything. Meanwhile, they're just going to ignore what's going on the rest of the planet, including Africa, where we were born as a species and where we spent most of our existence, and they're just going to focus on what was going on in Europe. Now, this is extremely convenient, because Europe, starting about 40,000 years ago, just so happens to be when and where we find the most evidence of human organizational diversity, and maybe the only place in the world where we have any interesting hints of potentially non-egalitarian societies. It also happens to be an extreme fringe environment, where the ice caps went down deep into modern Poland and Germany. In other words, an environment that is not particularly representative of what was going on in the rest of the world at that time, and an environment where we might expect to find unusual subsistence strategies and social structures. Focusing on Upper Paleolithic Europe in order to get a sense of what our original human social structures were like is a bit like trying to understand what was happening in ancient Rome by looking at what people in the Arctic Circle were doing in the 1800s. It looks like the ancient Romans ate a lot of seal blubber and lived in igloos and traded with coureurs des bois dudes from New France. So now that we're ignoring the entire world except for the northernmost fringes of human settlement, and we're ignoring the first 250,000 years of our existence, Graeber and Wengrow think that they can confidently argue that there is no origin to human inequality. Quote, "As we will see in a moment, the societies that resulted in what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 50,000 to 15,000 BC, with their princely burials and grand communal buildings, seem to completely defy our image of a world made up of tiny egalitarian forager bands. The disconnect is so profound that some archaeologists have begun taking the opposite tack, describing Ice Age Europe as populated by, quote, hierarchical or even stratified societies. In this, they make common cause with evolutionary psychologists, who insist that dominance behavior is hardwired in our genes, so much so that the moment society goes beyond tiny bands, it must be necessary to take the form of some ruling over others." Unquote. In just these 3 sentences, we have all kinds of annoying distortions and fishy statements. For one thing, they make it sound like Upper Paleolithic Europe is full of these burials, when we have like 5 or 6 of them across a 35,000-year time span. And those, quote, grand communal buildings that they talk about are very similar to those sorts of longhouses that relatively egalitarian Arctic Inuit hunter-gatherers have been building in recent times. Next, they insultingly make it sound like evolutionary psychologists are all right-wingers who think that dominance is our nature, which is a real slap in the face to all the important left-wing evolutionary psychologists and people influenced by them, like Christopher Boehm or Sarah Hrdy. Anyhow, they go on. Quote, "Almost everyone who isn't a Pleistocene archaeologist, that is, who is not forced to confront the evidence, simply ignores these burials and carries on exactly as they had before, writing as if hunter-gatherers can be assumed to have lived in a state of primordial innocence. As Christopher Boehm puts it, we seem doomed to play out an endless recycling of the war between Hobbesian hawks and Rousseauian doves, those who view humans as innately hierarchical or innately egalitarian." Unquote. So, the obnoxious Pinocchio's per sentence ratio is going off the charts here. First, no one in recent times ever says or even implies anything about primordial innocence. This is a hallucination, and I think also a projection by the authors who have some demented bugaboo where they think that anyone who talks about egalitarian societies is by definition seeing those societies as childish, which I think tells us way more about the author's views about equality than about the anthropology of egalitarian hunter-gatherers, which is nothing like that, except maybe for one book from the 1960s, The Forest People by Colin Turnbull, which I'll talk about later because I think it explains Graeber's demented attitude towards egalitarianism. The more I read these chapters to prepare for these critiques, the more I think that, much like Turgot, Graeber and Wengrow think that a state of true equality and true freedom can only be a state of childishness, and they just hate the idea almost as much as any right-winger does, if for different reasons. And we'll see how they treat actual egalitarian societies in Chapter 4. In reality, as we'll see shortly, the egalitarian origins thesis, despite being a materialist argument, is at the same time very much about conscious political action, like any good materialist thesis should be. And these conscious actions include a lot of murder. Like, this is not at all some kind of caricature of happy Smurfs living together in giant mushroom houses that the authors seem to be stuck on. Next, no one is ignoring the evidence. It's been discussed a lot over the years and has changed some of our previous assumptions. So today, there aren't many scholars who think that every single society on Earth was a hyper-egalitarian immediate return society until 12,000 years ago, or that the Upper Paleolithic Europe was just all immediate return hyper-egalitarian foragers. More importantly, even those who do interpret the evidence as pointing to hierarchy are always giving material explanations for it. For example, Brian Hayden, who argues strongly for hierarchy in Upper Paleolithic Europe, tells us, quote, "The fact that burials, especially those with substantial grave goods, cave art, portable prestige objects, and high site densities, all tend to occur in the same restricted areas of Europe, such as the French Périgord and Charente, is a strong indication that there was something special about these locations favoring all of these developments." Unquote. Finally, the passage I read where Graeber and Wengrow seem to imply that Boehm is chastising people for ignoring these burials because they're stuck in a Rousseau versus Hobbes paradigm is pretty misleading, because Boehm actually doesn't say anything about these Paleolithic burials in any work that I know of his. What Boehm is talking about there is the left-right debates that I was referring to earlier, which were going on until Boehm's 1999 book, Hierarchy in the Forest, where people on the left and right were arguing about Smurfs versus Gargamel-natured humans, a debate which Boehm's book is largely responsible for having resolved. And by the way, if you don't know the Smurfs, they're a cartoon egalitarian communist society whose members all live in giant mushrooms, and their motto is share and share alike. And they live under the benevolent guidance of Papa Smurf, who wears a red hat and has a big white beard like Karl Marx. And their enemy is the evil wizard Gargamel, who wants to enslave the Smurfs and turn them into gold, much like capitalism wants to do to all of us. So, the authors continue, quote, "Boehm's own work is revealing in this regard. An evolutionary anthropologist and specialist in primate studies, he argues that while humans do have an instinctual tendency to engage in submissive dominance behavior, what makes societies distinctively human is our ability to make the conscious decision not to act in that way." Unquote. The way the authors put it, Boehm is implying that people choose not to engage in dominant submissive behavior because they have good values, like Papa Smurf and the Smurfs. We want a good egalitarian society and not a bad hierarchical society, so we're going to be good people. But in many ways, Boehm is kind of saying the opposite of this. He's saying that many people do in fact choose to act like bullies, but in the context of most hunting and gathering societies, when someone acts like a bully or tries to hoard resources or power, the conditions are such that the people that he's trying to dominate will be able to successfully team up and stop him and his allies from getting anywhere. This is what Boehm calls reverse dominance, but which other scholars have called counter-dominance, which I think more accurately describes what's going on. Anyhow, the authors continue, quote, "Carefully working through ethnographic accounts of existing egalitarian foraging bands in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, Boehm identifies a whole panoply of tactics collectively employed to bring would-be bullies down to earth: ridicule, shame, shunning, and sometimes even outright assassination. Even more strikingly, while the bullying behavior might well be instinctual, counter-bullying is not. It's a well-thought-out strategy, and forager societies who engage in it display what Boehm calls actuarial intelligence. That is to say, they understand what their society might look like if they did things differently." Unquote. This is a decent summary, but again, it isn't exactly right. Bullying behavior might be instinctive, but it's also quite conscious. Bullies in human societies form coalitions in order to achieve domination, just like the alphas in our great ape cousins do. Also, counter-dominance is just as instinctive as dominance is. Boehm takes it for granted that people instinctively do not like to be bullied, and that they'll resist domination if and when they can. Instinct and consciousness work together. Then, in the next paragraph, the authors tell us, quote, "This," he concludes, "is the essence of politics, the ability to reflect consciously on different directions one's society could take, and to make explicit arguments why it should take one path rather than another." Unquote. What? Boehm does not conclude that or say that anywhere. Like, maybe he would agree with that statement, I don't know, but he certainly doesn't make any proclamations or statements about anything like the essence of politics or whatever. This is Graeber and Wengrow making Boehm into a Muppet and putting words into his mouth. And they do this a lot. We'll see some weird, confusing examples of this in the next episode. So yes, Boehm talks a lot about conscious action, and he argues that egalitarianism isn't just automatic. It requires people to actually be active in suppressing bullies in order to achieve it. But his argument is ultimately a materialist one about force and the balance of power, not about winning arguments about the direction society should take at some big, all-inclusive Occupy meeting. Anyhow, the authors continue. Quote, "This is a brilliant and important argument," referring to the statement that the authors put into Boehm's mouth that represents what they themselves think. But like so many authors, Boehm seems strangely reluctant to consider its full implications. Let's do so now. If the very essence of our humanity consists of the fact that we are self-conscious political actors, which is something that Boehm did not ever say, and therefore capable of embracing a wide range of social arrangements, would that not mean that human beings should actually have explored a wide range of social arrangements over the greater part of our history? Unquote. Well, if you mean that human beings should have explored organizing ourselves into dominance hierarchies, then the answer is, of course, no. Because dominance hierarchy is not a choice. It's an imposition. No one explores dominance hierarchy any more than one explores being sexually assaulted or beaten up or enslaved, which is what dominance hierarchy is. Back to the book. Quote, "In the end, confusingly, Boehm assumes that all human beings until very recently chose instead to follow exactly the same arrangements. We were strictly egalitarian for thousands of generations before hierarchical societies began to appear, thereby casually tossing early humans back into the Garden of Eden once again. Only with the beginnings of agriculture," Boehm suggests, "did we all collectively flip back to hierarchy. Before 12,000 years ago, humans were basically egalitarian, living in what he calls societies of equals, and outside the family there were no dominators." Unquote. Okay, so another big pile of Pinocchio stinkers in here. The authors are pretending to be confused, but there's nothing to be confused about if you actually read Boehm's book, Hierarchy in the Forest, which is really easy to read, and I highly recommend doing so. It's only confusing to the readers of Dawn of Everything because Graeber and Wengrow conveniently forgot to tell us what Boehm's logic and reasoning are behind his conclusions. What Graeber and Wengrow are doing is like reviewing the Bible and completely leaving out God, and then acting all confused about how the Jews crossed the Red Sea. Oh, that seems pretty unrealistic, that's dumb. And Boehm never said that people were strictly egalitarian. For example, he takes male dominance for granted, which I don't agree with, but more importantly and more shockingly, the authors criticize Boehm for thinking that human beings didn't explore a wide variety of social arrangements, when Boehm very clearly does believe that humans explored a wide variety of social arrangements, except that Boehm assumes that they were all relatively egalitarian social arrangements. In making his arguments about how Paleolithic societies maintained egalitarianism, Boehm discusses stories and examples from a whole range of different recent hunter-gatherer societies. Not just the hyper-egalitarian immediate return foragers that I always talk about, but also all sorts of less egalitarian foragers who have gender inequality and gerontocracy and sometimes weak chieftainship positions. And he clearly assumes that these forms of hierarchies existed in the Paleolithic as well, but he lumps them all into the category of egalitarian, which is actually something I've criticized Graeber for doing in the past, because in hunter-gatherer studies, we generally reserve the term egalitarian for hyper-egalitarian societies with gender equality and no leadership positions or gerontocracy. Later in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, Boehm goes on to point out that most societies on Earth were still relatively egalitarian in this broad sense for several thousand years, even after the advent of the Holocene and the adoption of agriculture by many societies. And as part of that discussion, he lists examples from a whole range of different agricultural and pastoralist societies who are relatively egalitarian, but usually have male domination and gerontocracy, including tribally organized societies, and societies organized into vast political confederations of relatively egalitarian horticulturalists, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose cultures were organized very similarly to those of Kondiaronk's Wendat Confederacy, their arch-enemies, and even societies like the Navajo, with chiefs who have very low levels of authority. Now, if we assume that the authors actually read Hierarchy in the Forest, which we can't actually assume because the standards of scholarship in humanities academia these days are shameful, like they literally tell you in grad school not to read your books properly, but if we assume that they actually read this short, easy-to-read book, then the implications of what they're saying are really astounding. It means that for the authors, a broad range of different social arrangements, hyper-egalitarian or with gerontocracy and male dominance, small bands with no leadership positions, to weak chieftainships, to tribally organized large confederations of warriors, to pastoralists, to cereal farmers, to horticulturalists, nomadic, to semi-sedentary. All of this is not good enough for Graeber and Wengrow in terms of humans exploring potential forms of social organization. Apparently, for the authors, human beings are only exploring our full potential if we are also organizing ourselves into dominance hierarchies, beyond just male dominance and gerontocracy. And anyone who thinks that we are all relatively egalitarian is saying that we're all a bunch of children with no agency. So says the anarchist anthropologist activist, sounding a lot like Turgot to my ears. And this makes sense, given Graeber's preoccupation in other parts of this book and in other of his works with trying to project all of our current and past social institutions backwards and forwards in time. Graeber seems to hate the idea that societies were ever too different from one another. So for example, according to Graeber, private property has always existed, even in totally hyper-egalitarian societies where there is no such thing as private property. Because the idea of the sacred is the root of private property, which he says in chapter 4. He also thinks that the state has always existed, at least in our minds, like in On Kings, where he and Marshall Salins pretend that even the most egalitarian societies see themselves as part of some cosmic hierarchy in their religious beliefs, which is total bullshit, as I've discussed before. And in Debt, he explains that primitive communism exists today just as in the past, expressed in family relations and friendship relations. In Graeber's ideology, we can't be fully human unless we have all of the same institutions as always, including dominance hierarchies. Anything less, and we're somehow less than human. On the one hand, I agree that being human means that we have the potential for all of these things, and that the seeds or roots of these institutions exist throughout time. And that's actually a really brilliant, important insight from Graeber, if you don't blow it up all out of proportion into this factually incorrect nonsense. Anyhow, the authors continue. Quote, "So according to Boehm, for about 200,000 years, political animals all chose to live just one way. Then, of course, they began to rush headlong into their chains, and ape-like dominance patterns reemerged. The solution to the battle between Hobbesian hawks and Rousseauian doves turns out to be, our genetic nature is Hobbesian, but our political history is pretty much exactly as described by Rousseau. The result? An odd insistence that for many tens of thousands of years, nothing happened. This is an unsettling conclusion, especially when we consider some of the actual archaeological evidence for the existence of Paleolithic politics." Unquote. Again, it's not nothing happened. If you read Boehm, it's implied that there were and still are constant power struggles, people repeatedly trying to get an edge over on others. And Boehm has a whole chapter just discussing example after example of people trying and failing to assert their dominance in egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, or else where they succeed for a time and then eventually get disciplined and often executed. For example, he talks about how sometimes an aggressive Inuit man might succeed in dominating others and becoming something like a chief for a while, but eventually the whole community would usually find a way to get rid of him. So lots of things happen in 200,000 years, but because of the conditions of nomadic hunting and gathering, most of the time, no one would have been able to successfully dominate anyone else for very long. And speaking of the relevant conditions to hierarchy or equality, the temperature was fluctuating wildly throughout the Paleolithic, not just in Europe, but all over the world. Waters are rising and falling within a generation or two, ice caps moving back and forth, habitable territories expanding and contracting, deserts growing and shrinking. Given these conditions, it would have been extremely unlikely that you'd be able to have societies with chiefs and commoners and nobility and slaves like what you see in the Pacific Northwest Coast Indians or the Calusa in Florida had. This is probably a big reason why Homo sapiens is such a big-brained jack-of-all-trades species in the first place. For all of the extended 2 million year or so period of our evolution into Homo sapiens, we lived in the crazy Paleolithic, where our environments were changing every couple of generations, and we had to change our subsistence strategies each time to adapt, which is what culture is all about. You usually need a stable territory and a good amount of time in order to establish a proper stratified hierarchy. Like I mentioned in an earlier episode, it took 800 years for the Pacific Northwest Coast peoples to develop their hierarchical system. But in the Paleolithic, an analogous society would likely have had to move and shift their subsistence strategy something like 10 or 20 times over that period. And in squeeze times, you might have a lot of competition and nowhere to escape to, which might give you the beginnings of hierarchy. But in times where the habitable environment expanded, you'd have all sorts of places to expand and escape to. This is why Boehm, and most people with knowledge, believe that we were mostly organized into small egalitarian bands for most of the Paleolithic, which the evidence seems to say as well, until we get towards the end of the Paleolithic, where we start to see more semi-sedentary foraging in various places around the world. But even if we were organized into small bands, they weren't isolated bands. These bands were fissioning and fusing inside webs of enormous communities thousands of miles wide. Now, the conditions that favored equality changed significantly with the advent of the Holocene 12,000 years ago, where the climate became much more stable. This made sedentary and semi-sedentary living possible for much longer periods of time. And along with increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this made long-term dependence on agriculture possible for the first time, both of which in turn make hierarchy much more possible by making criteria number 1 possible. But these phenomena alone are not sufficient on their own to explain the explosion of hierarchy which happens when criteria number 2 starts to get fulfilled more and more around the world, as we'll discuss in the future. The authors then tell us about the rich hunter-gatherer burials, which we find across western Eurasia, from the Dordogne to the Don, dating back from 34,000 years ago to about 16,000 years ago. And the famous sites are Sungir in northern Russia, where there's a corpse adorned with garments made with fine beads, which would have taken over 10,000 hours of labor to make and assemble. There's Dolní Věstonice, which I don't know how to pronounce, which is in modern Czechia, where you have a triple burial of 3 men with elaborate high-ranking looking headdresses. You have a group of cave burials on the coast of Liguria, near the border between Italy and France, which includes one particularly lavish burial known as the Prince, Il Principe, who has a staff and fancy accoutrements that others around him don't have. And then you have the highly ornamented Lady of Saint-Germain-de-la-Rivière burial in the Dordogne area. Quote, "Such findings have completely altered the specialist view of human societies in prehistory. The pendulum has swung so far away from the old notion of egalitarian bands that some archaeologists now argue that thousands of years before the origins of farming, human societies were already divided along lines of status, class, and inherited power." Unquote. Now this is funny, because since the beginning of the book, they've been telling us that everyone today is still stuck in this egalitarian origins paradigm, how we're stuck in tiny little bands. But now they're telling us that the pendulum has swung totally in the other direction, and everyone today is arguing that the Paleolithic was full of hierarchy. The authors then go on to talk about monumental architecture in Upper Paleolithic Europe. But for some reason, they start off by talking about Gobleki Tepe, which is a spectacular monumental architecture site in Anatolia in Turkey, and which is extra spectacular because it was probably built by semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers, and archaeologists still can't exactly figure out how they managed to do this. But Gobleki Tepe has no place in this discussion. It's 11,500 years old, meaning that it was built in the Holocene era, a couple of centuries after the climate had completely changed, and not in the Pleistocene Paleolithic era where humanity emerged. So where the Upper Paleolithic Europe that the authors focus on tells us almost nothing about human origins, the early Holocene tells us even less. It's like if you're writing about traditional pre-contact European Native American societies, and then you focus all your discussion on the amazing casinos that you have on Indian reservations today. Also, as part of this discussion of monumental architecture, the authors talk about the Mammoth Houses in Europe that were put together at some point between 25,000 and 12,000 years ago, up in what at that time was an Arctic type of environment, spread across an area reaching from Krakow to Kiev. Now, as other critics have mentioned, calling these mammoth houses monumental architecture is a huge stretch. Monumental architecture refers to giant constructions that take an enormous amount of labor hours to build. Most mammoth houses were actually just like little igloo-sized tents made from mammoth parts. There were some larger buildings that look like public assembly halls, which the authors focus on, or else like multifamily homes. But these are similar to the types of structures that recent Inuit populations had in winter, which we'll look at next episode. There's nothing at all like Gobleki Tepe, the likes of which I think would have been impossible to create during the Paleolithic era. Anyhow, the authors go on. Quote, "So what are we to make of all this evidence for stone temples, princely burials, mammoth monuments, and bustling centers of trade and craft production, stretching back far into the Ice Age? Unsurprisingly, perhaps, some have responded by completely abandoning the idea of an egalitarian golden age, concluding instead that this must have been a society dominated by powerful leaders, even dynasties, and therefore that self-aggrandizement and coercive power have always been the enduring forces behind human social evolution." Unquote. No one has ever argued this, as far as I know. The authors are just saying this to make themselves sound like even bigger wannabe rebels than they are. But anyhow, they go on to say that this non-existent theory isn't right either. And then they reveal to us what I just mentioned a few seconds ago. Quote, "Evidence of institutional inequality in Ice Age societies, whether grand burials or monumental buildings, is sporadic. Richly costumed burials appear centuries and often hundreds of miles apart. Even if we put this down to the patchiness of the evidence, we still have to ask why the evidence is so patchy in the first place." Unquote. So after planting a wildly inaccurate portrait of the European Upper Paleolithic in our minds, now they finally tell us what I just told you before, which is that all this stuff is actually quite exceptional. And then later on in the chapter, Graeber and Wengrow are going to point out that there's a good chance that those hierarchical burials aren't even very hierarchical at all, as they're mostly individuals with really unusual physical characteristics and deformities, who often look like they were buried with those fancy ornaments because there was some ritual significance placed on unusual people in those societies. We'll get back to that next time, but the next paragraph after the one I just read says, quote, "After all, if any of those Ice Age princes had behaved like, say, Bronze Age, let alone Renaissance Italian princes, we'd also be finding all the usual trappings of centralized power, fortifications, storehouses, palaces. Instead, over tens of thousands of years, we see monuments and magnificent burials, but little else to indicate the growth of ranked societies, let alone anything remotely resembling states." Unquote. Say what? No one has ever talked about Paleolithic states or anything near approaching that. At most, people think that maybe some of these societies might have been a bit like the Pacific Northwest Coast chiefdoms with social classes, which are the most hierarchical types of hunter-gatherer societies that we know of. States would have been completely impossible in the Paleolithic, as with things like palaces and fortifications. Like, they're messing with our minds by pretending that Gobleki Tepe was happening at this time, which it was not. Even long-term, full-time sedentary settlements were likely extremely rare to non-existent in the Paleolithic. If there were chiefs or authority figures in the Upper Paleolithic, they wouldn't have had the option to behave like Bronze Age or Renaissance princes. Their population densities were so low, and they would have had no way to marshal the necessary resources, among many other reasons. I don't even understand why they're talking about this stuff, except that it looks like the authors are basically trying to position themselves above the fray of a non-existent debate. There's dum-dums on one side who think that we were all egalitarian forager children, while dum-dums on the other side think that there were medieval states all over Paleolithic Europe. But we know better. Basically, what Graeber and Wengrow have done so far in this chapter is they start with a false premise, that anthropologists believe that every single society on Earth was the exact same kind of egalitarian nomadic hunting and gathering society. And then they show us a bunch of exceptional stuff to disprove this non-existent false premise. And then they take it back after already painting the idea in our heads. By talking about monumental architecture and states, even to refute states, they make it sound as if things were not at all as mainstream anthropologists present them. Yet they present zero evidence for any of this. Remember that what they're doing here is they're trying to refute the idea of egalitarian origins and replace it with the idea that inequality has no origins. We were always just everything at the same time. Everything except for stuck. So far, their biggest argument against egalitarian origins that they've presented is that we can assume that there must have been as much diversity in terms of presence and absence of dominance hierarchies because hobbits.
Great job.
So they got nothing. I'll put a couple of articles by people who disagree with egalitarian origins in the bibliography so you can see some of these arguments for yourselves. But the authors can't make these arguments, or any real argument, because every argument for or against egalitarian origins equates social structure with economic activity and logistical conditions, which is exactly what the authors do not want us to think about. Again, trying to refute egalitarian origins is just incidental to their real message about how social structure is some kind of conscious choice. Anyhow, the authors go on. Quote, to understand why the early record of human social life is patterned in this strange staccato fashion, we first have to do away with some lingering preconceptions about, quote, primitive mentalities, unquote. And then they obnoxiously title the next section, quote, in which we dispose of lingering assumptions that primitive folk were somehow incapable of conscious reflection, and draw attention to the historical importance of eccentricity. In the last chapter, we suggested that the really insidious element of Rousseau's legacy is not so much the idea of the noble savage as that of the stupid savage. We may have got over the overt racism of most 19th century Europeans, or at least we think we have, but it's not unusual to find even very sophisticated contemporary thinkers who feel it's more appropriate to compare bands of hunter-gatherers with chimps or baboons than with anyone they'd ever be likely to meet, unquote. Every part of this makes my blood boil. Again, they're basically pretending that anthropology is still in the 1950s. And once again, this is a huge insult to everyone working in these human origins fields. I'm sorry, but the stupid savage is the legacy of colonialism and capitalism, not of Rousseau. And while that legacy is still very much part of the popular imagination, it's long gone from anthropology. The authors go on to cite Yuval Harari, who, remember, is not an anthropologist, and they shit on him for comparing prehistoric foragers' potentially warlike or peaceful dispositions to that of chimps versus bonobos, instead of to human biker gangs versus hippies. And they suggest that Harari is doing this because he thinks that hunter-gatherers, like bonobos and chimps, have no agency, hinting that it's racist to make these comparisons. Now, I'm not a big fan of Harari. I find a lot of what he says in his Sapiens book to be even more obnoxious than the stuff that I'm criticizing in this book. But Jesus Christ, if what you're talking about is humans' innate disposition and propensity towards war or towards peace or hierarchy or equality, then of course you're going to compare us to our closest animal relatives, bonobos, who are largely peaceful and more egalitarian, and chimps, who are much more aggressive and hierarchical. And we're not going to compare ourselves to other humans, like bikers and hippies, which makes no fucking sense, because the whole point here is to compare humans in our original state, hunting and gathering, a so-called state of nature, to other species in their natural states. It's the same reason we always compare ourselves to chimpanzees in the wild and bonobos in the wild, and not chimpanzees and bonobos who live in zoos, unless we're trying to make a point about how artificial conditions change our social structures and our behaviors. Insinuating that this is somehow racist or infantilizing or insulting to humans is such sanctimonious, counterproductive bullshit. It's also just incredibly ignorant, because bonobos and chimps and other animals do very much have political agency. For example, the instinct to dominate and act aggressively is just one small element of chimp hierarchy. Much like humans, chimps can't actually establish themselves on top of a dominance hierarchy just based on these dumb instincts. To become an alpha, you also need to deliberately and carefully cultivate and form coalitions in order to successfully dominate the rest of the group. Otherwise, people will be able to unite and repel and chase you off. In an upcoming episode, I'm going to use chimpanzee politics as an analogy to explain what happened in terms of labor relations when McDonald's came to Sweden in the 1980s and tried to break the unions there. If anything, we should compare bikers and hippies to chimps and bonobos, not to hunter-gatherers. The authors then ask, quote, perhaps the real question here is what it means to be a self-conscious political actor, unquote. Yes, I agree. What makes a political actor isn't someone randomly making choices in a sensory deprivation tank virtual reality video game. It's making choices under certain conditions that generate imbalances of power. Okay, so that's it for now. Next time we'll finish the rest of Chapter 3, where they lecture us about the so-called primitive mentality. In the meantime, if you feel new creases forming in your formerly smooth brain because of this show, and you want to support me, please subscribe to my Patreon or send me one-time donations, which I'll need to set up. Making a show like this takes a lot of time and thought, and reading and writing and wrong turns and startovers and editing, and I'm very slow at all of these things, so it takes about 2 to 6 weeks full-time to produce one episode of this, in which time I'm not doing any paid work, so I'm not earning any money, which is just brutal and not sustainable. Also, I don't monetize my channel, even though I'm eligible for it now, because I don't want to gunk up your life with even more stupid advertisements than you're already subjected to. And I don't do paywalled content because that defeats the whole purpose of doing this show, so your subscriptions are not commodity purchases, they're solidarity payments, because you can afford it and you want the show to keep going. And I charge per episode, not per month, because it takes so long to actually make these, and also because sometimes I need to take extended breaks. And if you don't have money, well, don't feel guilty and don't give me money that you don't have. But if you have the chance, please tell other people about this show, as it's really hard to get the word out in this algorithm-ruled, super-saturated podcast landscape. In particular, if you're in contact with any prominent-ish YouTube's personages or podcasters, and there's an episode that's relevant to them, please share it with them. It seems like a boost from someone like that is the only way to grow your audience these days. I mentioned Matt Christman. Check out his Kush vlogs or grill stream videos and podcasts. And also check out Fight Like an Animal, who recently reviewed Dawn of Everything on the episode Ethnogenesis Part 4. And check out the Alpha to Omega podcasts Understanding Class series and their Fundamental Principles of Communism series, where they're reading a couple of interesting and important books. And please like and subscribe, and also review this show on iTunes or Apple Music. It's really important and helps the show pop up more readily on searches. And contact me with any corrections or suggestions or comments at worldwidescroats@gmail.com, or comment on the YouTubes. And until next time, see ya!